16th century Swiss doctor Paracelsus once said, "All things are poisons, for there is nothing without poisonous qualities. It is only the dose which makes a thing poison." In 1950s Georgia, it was all too easy to receive an excessively high dose of Anjette Donovan Lyles. Lyles ran a popular diner in downtown Macon, Georgia, and she oozed southern charm, wowing customers with her lemon pie and banana pudding. But behind the home-cooked meals and the bright red lipstick smile lurked a dangerous killer from whom none of her family members were safe. Anjette was born on 23rd of August 1925 to parents William and Jetta Donovan in Macon, Georgia. Ever since she was a child, she'd been able to convince her parents and her two brothers to do what she wanted, not by tantrums, but by trickery. Her father ran a grocery company and the family was reasonably wealthy, so Anjette grew up comfortably and went to a good school. She met and married military man Ben Lyles in 1947 when she was 22 and began working at their family restaurant, Lyles, on Mulberry Street in downtown Macon, which had belonged to Ben's late father and was now run by Ben and his mother Julia. The following year, Anjette and Ben's eldest child Marcia was born. Even after the birth, Anjette continued to work in the restaurant and often brought Marcia in to work with her, who received plenty of attention from adoring customers. Anjette herself was a popular fixture at Lyles, habitually dressed in the flared shirt-waist dresses and aprons that were typical of the decade, paired with bright red lipstick, the costume that helped her play the part of a charming wife and mother who liked nothing better than to please people with her home-cooked food. She was always friendly with a winning smile and frequently received compliments on her lemon pie and banana pudding. Ben and Anjette's married bliss was not to last. Ben developed rheumatic fever and was unable to keep his job in the army, so he subsisted on veterans' benefits while his mother Julia and wife Anjette continued to bring in money from the restaurant. By the time Marcia was 3 years old and their second child Carla had just arrived, Ben had developed a taste for gambling and quickly spiraled into debt. Anjette was horrified when he sold the restaurant for just $2,500 without asking her opinion, which she felt was an outrageously cheap price for such a popular, established business. Without the income from Lyles, they struggled to meet their basic needs, and Anjette had to ask her family for help. By the end of the year, Ben developed a sudden and serious illness which doctors could not explain. Blood leaked from his nose and mouth, his arms and legs swelled up, and he suffered from episodes of uncontrollable twitching. He died on 25th of January 1952 from encephalitis, an uncommon but life-threatening swelling of the brain. Anjette had become a widow at the age of just 26. The bright and charismatic young woman surprised everyone with her resilience in the face of tragedy. She and her 2 young daughters moved in with her parents, and she took up waitressing and bookkeeping jobs to save as much money as she could to secure her future. Just over 3 years later, in April 1955, Anjette had saved enough money to buy back Lyles' restaurant for $12,000, almost 5 times as much as Ben had sold it for. This time she wanted to be the one in charge. She renamed it Anjette's, and she was determined not to let anyone take it away from her again. It quickly reclaimed its status as the most popular eatery in town, and going through its doors felt like a warm embrace for the locals, who were welcomed by her friendly smile and delicious dishes made with southern flavours and served with southern charm. Even businessmen from local officers and attorneys from the courthouse came to eat there, and several airline pilots were regulars as Macon Airport wasn't far away. One of these pilots, 26-year-old Texan Joe Gabbert, took an interest in Anjette as soon as he set eyes on her. He flew commercial planes for Capital Airways, but had previously served as a Marine in the Korean War. After dating for just 2 months, Joe and Anjette married quickly and secretly to the surprise of family and friends. Anjette's father had died recently, and she was still living with her mother since Joe spent so much time away for his job flying planes. A few months later, Joe had a minor operation on his wrist, and while recovering at home, he became feverish with a mysterious weeping rash spreading all over his body. Anjette cared for him at home at the beginning, but when her husband's arms and legs swelled to twice their usual size, she took him to hospital. The strange condition was causing him so much pain that he begged the doctors to let him die. He was transferred to the Veterans Hospital in Dublin, Georgia, a little over 50 miles away. If any of the hospital staff recalled that they had received an inquiry from Anjette just 3 days after she married Joe to check that his veteran's life insurance policy was up to date, then they must have thought nothing of it. Later, it would be an important piece of evidence that would help to form a very sinister picture. Anjette seemed pessimistic about Joe's chances, telling hospital staff that she didn't think he would make it. She was so convinced that her second husband would make a swift exit from the world that she asked another patient at the hospital, who happened to be an attorney, to speak to him about drawing up a will. The man agreed, but was unable to follow through with his promise when he realised that Joe was too ill to express his wishes. A few days later, against all odds, Joe began to improve and was discharged home to Anjette's care, where his symptoms returned almost immediately. Rather than take him back to the hospital, Anjette hired a nurse called Jenny to take care of him. Jenny had no option but to feed Joe intravenously, as he suffered from bouts of violent vomiting if he tried to eat. His veins collapsed a short time later, and Jenny warned Anjette that her husband needed urgent hospital treatment. An ambulance was called and Joe was readmitted to the Veterans Hospital. In his final days, Anjette let slip some odd things to the nurse she had hired. Jenny was unsettled to hear that Anjette didn't want Joe's parents to travel from Texas to see their son, but if they did insist on coming, she wanted Jenny to tell them that he had received the best possible care. Jenny wasn't convinced that he had, as she had urged Anjette to take Joe to the hospital several days earlier, advising that he was too ill to continue receiving treatment at home. The icing on the cake was when Anjette told her that she wouldn't let her mother-in-law receive any of Joe's money when he died, which seemed an unusual matter to be worried about when her husband lay on the cusp of life and death. Joe died of kidney failure on 2nd of December 1955, just 6 months after marrying Anjette. An autopsy was ordered as doctors were unsure what had caused his illness. Anjette pled with the coroner not to cut him up and refused to grant permission, but the coroner didn't need her authority and went ahead anyway. Anjette must have been relieved when the autopsy was inconclusive, with no indication of what had led to his agonising death. She received a $20,000 life insurance payout and used it to buy a house in Macon, a car, flashy clothes and a new look, transforming from brunette to bottle blonde. The first sign that her charming exterior was starting to slip came when restaurant staff noticed a change in her behaviour, and she told them openly that she should never have married Joe and that she had seen to it that his mother hadn't received a dime of the insurance money. She changed her surname back to Lyles and complained bitterly when her former mother-in-law Julia moved in with her. It was impossible not to notice that Anjette was fixated with wills, telling the restaurant staff that Julia hadn't made one, so she was concerned that the estate would go to the surviving son, Joseph. Julia refused to write a will but was happy to look after her granddaughters while Anjette was working. Rumours began to spread when Anjette announced she was dating a man named Bob Franks, suspiciously soon after Joe's death. She told people that Bob had a good job and a big life insurance policy, two attributes which seemed to be a prerequisite for anyone wishing to attract Anjette's affections. Her mother-in-law Julia Lyles was the next person to fall sick in August of 1957. She began vomiting blood, her arms and legs swelled and her skin turned purple. Restaurant staff noticed that each time Anjette left to visit Julia in hospital, she first conducted a bizarre ritual of filling a cup with juice and taking it into the bathroom with her handbag, emerging 5 minutes later. Once at the hospital, Anjette would play the part of the loving daughter-in-law and topped up Julia's juice while mentioning to the doctors that she didn't believe Julia would live. She handed them a note written in shaky writing which said, "I, Julia Lyles, give full authority to my daughter-in-law Anjette to arrange my funeral should the worst happen." This showed uncanny foresight, but was a little premature, as it took another month for 58-year-old Julia Lyles to give up her fight for life, 5 years after her son Ben had died from a similar strange illness. A copy of Julia's will surfaced a week after the funeral, naming Anjette as the executor of the estate. Her assets were to be split between Julia's son Joseph, Anjette and Anjette's daughters. Anjette herself would hold the money in trust until her little girls reached adulthood. It remained a mystery how Anjette had managed to convince her mother-in-law to draw up a will when she had previously been so reluctant to do so. By now, the gossip in town was increasing in volume. It didn't take a detective to connect the dots and notice the fact that Anjette had benefited financially from the deaths of 3 people. Her behaviour grew more erratic, and she even shouted at her 9-year-old daughter Marcia in front of the restaurant staff, threatening to kill her, although 5-year-old Carla seemed to escape the brunt of her mother's anger. A colleague took the chance to peek into Anjette's bag, where she discovered a bottle of ant poison, but wasn't sure what to do about it. On 2nd of March 1958, Marcia started coughing and burning up, complaining of a severe headache. Anjette had brought her to the restaurant that day and ignored her daughter's pleas to go home, but eventually when Marcia began vomiting, Anjette relented. 3 days later, she was admitted to hospital in the very same ward where her father, grandmother and stepfather had been treated prior to their deaths. Marcia received the same fruit juice that Anjette had routinely given Julia, disappearing into the hospital bathroom with a handbag each time. The doctors had not realised what was going on, but by now the restaurant staff were gravely concerned and sent an anonymous note to Julia Lyles' sister, Nora Bagley, which read, "Please come at once, she's getting the same dose as the others." Marcia rapidly deteriorated, bleeding from her nose and mouth and vomiting uncontrollably. As she entered the final stages of kidney failure, she became delirious and shouted that monsters were coming to get her and insects were crawling out of her fingers. Anjette laughed, calmly telling the nurses, "Marcia will be going home to her father soon," and swiftly turned her attention to planning her daughter's funeral. Marcia died a few weeks later. This time, Anjette had gone too far. Alerted by the anonymous note, Nora Bagley called the coroner to raise her concerns about her great-niece's death, and an autopsy was carried out. Once again, nothing unusual was found, but everyone in town seemed to suspect that Anjette Donovan Lyles was a killer, even if they couldn't prove it yet. She had gone from being a hospitable southern belle loved by her community to being referred to in hushed whispers as the Black Widow of Macon. Restaurant staff took matters into their own hands and sent another anonymous note, this time to the coroner, telling him that Anjette had murdered her daughter with ant poison. Coroner Lester Chapman began an investigation and purchased the same brand of ant poison to analyse its contents. When he found that it contained arsenic, he contacted county pathologist Dr. Leonard Campbell, who ordered the funeral to be delayed so he could conduct a second autopsy. He took tissue samples from Marcia's liver, kidneys and hair and sent them to the state crime lab in Atlanta. Because arsenic binds to keratin, the protein from which hair, skin and nails are made, hair samples can reveal the time that arsenic exposure occurred. After the samples were taken, Marcia's body was released for the funeral. During the service, Anjette told a friend that her surviving daughter Carla, now 6 years old, had said that she wanted to go to heaven to be with Marcia. After the funeral, the coroner confronted Anjette with his findings and the anonymous letter he had received and asked if she had anything to say. She said nothing, but the following day she returned to his office with Carla and instructed her daughter to tell the coroner how she and her friends had been playing doctors and given the ant poison to Marcia as medicine. In disbelief, the coroner challenged Anjette to use the phone on his desk to call the parents of the other children involved in the game. Without batting an eyelid, she dialed some numbers and reeled off the story, sounding chillingly convincing. It would later emerge that she had rung the number of her own home and entirely dramatised her end of the conversation. But she knew she couldn't use a child's game to explain the other deaths. She faked a suicide note, supposedly from her deceased mother-in-law, confessing to poisoning her son Ben and then taking the substance herself out of guilt. Analysts at the lab weren't fooled and found that Julia's signature had been forged using tracing paper over her real signature. Anjette's denials no longer mattered when the hair and tissue samples came back from the lab, confirming that high levels of arsenic had been present in Marcia's body. An exhumation order was granted for Ben, Julia and Joe's remains, and arsenic was found in all of them. Police found several empty bottles of ant poison in Anjette's home, at the restaurant, and in her purse, along with tracing paper. She was arrested for murder on 6th of May 1958. The trial was both disturbing and sensational, and it was difficult to hide the news that candles and tarot cards had been found during the police search of her home. At the time, a belief in anything other than Christianity in Bible Belt Georgia was taboo, and the media made much of Anjette's interest in magic and fortune-telling, with some people accusing her of practicing voodoo. The restaurant staff already knew that she liked to light different coloured candles and whisper her desires to them in the belief that it would make them come true, but to others it came as a blasphemous revelation. The jury listened as the prosecutor outlined the horrifying facts. Anjette had received over $50,000 in life insurance claims, worth over $500,000 today. The will she claimed had been written by Julia Lyles was a forgery, and Anjette had been seen feeding liquid to each of her family members shortly before their deaths. Her lack of remorse was like a punch in the gut to anyone who had once believed she was a pillar of the town. In defiance of the stories of candles and black magic, she brought a Bible to court with her each day, but her eyes remained dry throughout the proceedings. On 13th of October 1958, Anjette Donovan Lyles was found guilty of Marcia's murder. She had only been indicted for the murder of her daughter, despite strong evidence that she had also killed 2 husbands and a mother-in-law, but the details of their deaths were used to illustrate to the jury the malevolent pattern of Anjette's actions. But one murder conviction was all that was needed to seal Anjette's fate, and she was sentenced to death by electric chair. She received the news as calmly as she had on the 4 occasions she'd been told by hospital staff of each family member's passing. An insanity appeal was lodged and a stay of execution was granted while her case was examined by a sanity commission. After she claimed seeing angels flying around the room, Anjette was declared legally insane, saving her from the death penalty. She was committed to the Central State Hospital where she lived for 19 years, passing the time by working in the hospital kitchen and reading other patients' fortunes using a pack of playing cards. Anjette died of a heart attack at the age of 52 on 4th of December 1977 and was buried next to daughter Marcia and former husband Ben at the Lyles family plot, in a spot that many would say she had no right to occupy. It's equal parts fascinating and appalling how a friendly, warm and charismatic restaurateur known for her down-home country cooking could turn out to be a calculating murderer who dispatched 4 members of her family, including her own child, and watched them die excruciating deaths. Anjette Donovan Lyles was masquerading as a southern dream when she was truly a southern nightmare. But as American writer Ambrose Bierce once pointed out, beauty can hide a multitude of sins. After all, the word belladonna has 2 meanings. In Italian, it means a beautiful lady, but the pretty sounding word hides its true character as a deadly poison. Were Anjette's actions purely for financial gain? Did she enjoy the sympathy she received when her husband and daughter died? Or did she get a thrill out of killing in itself? Perhaps it was a mixture of all these ingredients in her recipe for death. Thank you for listening to this episode of Prash's Murder Map. This case was taken from my true crime book, Murder Casebook Volume 2. Join me again next time as we travel to the streets of New Orleans to explore the case of the mysterious Axeman who terrorized the city, coming out in time for Halloween. There are several ways you can support the show if you're able to. The podcast is 100% independent and is researched, written and produced by myself and my wife, so any help is greatly appreciated. Please subscribe and leave me a review wherever you get your podcasts. Or you can support me on Patreon, make a one-off donation via PayPal, or buy me a coffee at ko-fi.com. You can find all the links in the show notes. For news about my books and free true crime blog posts, check out my website, www.prashganandran.com. I really appreciate your support, and I'll see you again soon.